Some evenings feel ordinary at first, yet they quietly teach a little heart how to grow up in just a few moments. Not because that little heart suddenly becomes strong. Not because it knows exactly what to do. But because when someone it loves is in pain, it chooses not to run away. It is scared. It is confused. It does not know what to do first. But it stays. That night, the small peaceful house suddenly became quiet because of BUEM's painful breathing. BUEM was lying on the floor, curled up uncomfortably, his little face tightening as BUEM's hot hands held his stomach. Cutis came upstairs from below. At first, Cutis thought BUEM was just lying there like usual, but the closer he came, the more he realized something was wrong. BUEM was not smiling. He was not reaching out to play. He was only lying there, struggling with discomfort written all over his face. Cutis' tiny heart tightened. He rushed to BUEM's side and bent down to look carefully. His eyes were filled with worry. He gently touched BUEM's shoulder, as if asking what had happened. BUEM looked weakly at Cutis and said that his stomach hurt badly. That one sentence was enough to make Cutis panic. At that moment, nothing else remained in Cutis' mind except fear. He was afraid BUEM would hurt even more, afraid BUEM would cry, afraid that if he was too slow, something worse might happen. But Cutis still tried to stay calm. He gently carried BUEM to the bed and carefully laid him down. Then he placed his small hand on BUEM's stomach, trying to check on him while comforting him. Everything will be okay. Cutis was not sure what he could do, but he knew one thing clearly: BUEM should not be alone while hurting like this. And from that moment on, an ordinary evening inside the little house became a story of worry, love, and responsibility. After placing BUEM carefully on the bed, Cutis looked around the room with worried eyes. He remembered that whenever someone in the house had a stomachache or felt uncomfortable, Dad would usually take a bottle of medicated oil and rub it gently. Cutis had seen Dad do it before. Just a few drops of oil, a few warm touches, and the person in pain would feel better. The moment Cutis thought of that, he quickly stood up. He turned to look at BUEM once more. BUEM was still holding his stomach, his tired eyes following Cutis. That look made Cutis even more anxious. Cutis seemed to be telling him to wait just a little longer. Then he hurried outside to search for the bottle of oil. Cutis searched the cabinet first. He pulled open each drawer and looked into every small corner, but he found nothing. He ran to another cabinet. Familiar objects were moved aside as Cutis searched carefully from top to bottom, from left to right. He bent down to check the lowest corners, then stretched his hand toward higher places. But the bottle of oil was nowhere to be found. The more Cutis searched, the more worried he became. The sound of BUEM's uncomfortable breathing seemed to echo inside his head. Every passing second made Cutis feel slower and more helpless. Finally, Cutis stood in the middle of the house and held his head with both hands. He felt disappointed. There was no oil. He did not know what to do. Dad had not appeared yet. BUEM was still in pain. At that moment, Cutis suddenly thought of the pharmacy. If there was no oil at home, he would go outside and buy medicine. As soon as that idea appeared, Cutis rushed to the cabinet. He searched for the money bag, took out some money, and grabbed a flashlight. Outside, the night had already fallen. But in Cutis' mind, there was only BUEM. He held the flashlight tightly, kept the money in his hand, and ran out of the house as quickly as he could. His tiny steps were hurried, and his heart was just as rushed. He had to be fast. He had to buy the medicine. He had to bring it back to BUEM. But once he reached the dark road outside, fear began to rise inside him. After running for a short distance, Cutis slowly began to slow down. The road was darker than he had imagined. The small flashlight in his hand could only light up a short space in front of him. Both sides of the road were silent. Everything seemed wider, farther, and more frightening without Dad beside him. Cutis swallowed nervously. He still wanted to keep going. He still wanted to buy medicine for BUEM. He still wanted to prove that he could help his little brother. But the longer he stood in the darkness, the more he realized how small he truly was. He did not know whether the pharmacy was still open. He did not know whether he was going the right way. And he did not know what would happen to BUEM at Mort, Fay home, if something happened to him on the road. At that moment, Cutis' courage did not disappear. It simply changed into another form. He stood still for a long while. His small eyes looked toward the road ahead, then back toward the house behind him. In that house was BUEM, still lying in pain. In that house was Dad, the person Cutis could ask for help. Finally, Cutis turned around. He ran back home as fast as he could. This time, his steps were still hurried, but his heart had made a clearer decision. He could not go alone into the dark night, but he could find Dad. He could ask an adult to help BUEM. When he reached home, Cutis did not immediately run to the bathroom to find Dad. He hurried to BUEM's room first. He stood by the doorway, quietly watching. BUEM was still lying on the bed, holding his stomach, his face still twisted in pain. Seeing him still struggling almost made Cutis cry. The fear inside him rose again. There was no more time to hesitate. Cutis immediately ran down to the bathroom. He knew Dad was inside. He stood in front of the door and knocked hard with his tiny hands. Each knock sounded urgent. Cutis could not fully say how scared he was, but those knocks said everything for him. "Dad, please come out quickly. BUEM is hurting so much. I do not know what to do anymore." A moment later, Dad finished bathing and opened the door. He saw Cutis standing there with a flashlight still in his hand, his face filled with panic, his breathing quick, as if he had just run a long way. Dad immediately knew something was wrong. He bent down and asked Cutis why he was so frightened, and why he was holding a flashlight as if he was about to go somewhere in the dark. The moment Cutis heard Dad's question, everything inside him seemed to spill out. He quickly explained BUEM's situation. BUEM's stomach was hurting badly. BUEM was lying on the bed, struggling in pain. Cutis had searched for the medicated oil, but could not find it. He had wanted to go buy medicine by himself, but the road outside was too dark, so he came back to find Dad. Dad listened carefully, his expression shifting from surprise to concern. But he did not scold Cutis. He simply held Cutis for a moment, as if helping him calm down. That hug made Cutis feel that he no longer had to be strong all by himself. Then Dad carried Cutis into BUEM's room to check on him. BUEM was still uncomfortable. Dad sat beside the bed and gently placed his hand on BUEM's stomach, rubbing it slowly. Dad's movements were much calmer than Cutis's. That calmness slowly softened the fear that had filled the room. Cutis stood beside Dad, his eyes never leaving BUEM. He wanted to know whether BUEM felt better. He wanted to hear Dad say that everything would be okay. After checking BUEM, Dad turned to Cutis and told him to stay home and watch over his little brother while Dad went to buy medicine. Cutis looked at Dad, still a little worried about staying with BUEM alone, but he nodded. Dad was trusting him, and Cutis understood that now he had to do his part well. Dad quickly left the house to buy the medicine. Cutis sat down beside BUEM, gently placed his hand on BUEM's stomach, and comforted him while softly rubbing it. "It is okay, BUEM. Dad went to buy medicine. I am here with you." When Dad left the house, the room suddenly became quieter. But that quiet did not make Cutis feel relieved. It only made him hear BUEM's uncomfortable breathing more clearly. Every small movement, every sign that his little brother was still not okay. Cutis sat beside the bed and gently rubbed BUEM's stomach. He did not know whether he was doing it exactly like Dad, but he tried to remember every movement Dad had just made. His hand had to move slowly. He could not press too hard. He had to make BUEM feel comforted, not hurt even more. BUEM looked at Cutis. In those tired eyes, there was a small trace of gratitude. That made Cutis love him even more. He leaned closer and gently held BUEM in his arms. BUEM rested against Cutis, no longer struggling as much as before, but the pain still made him uncomfortable. Cutis felt BUEM's small body in his embrace. At that moment, Cutis no longer thought about his own fear. He only thought that BUEM needed to be held. BUEM needed to know someone was there. Time passed strangely slowly. Cutis felt that Dad had been gone for a long time, so he stood up and went out to the porch. He looked toward the road, glancing around, hoping to see Dad coming back. But the porch was still empty. Cutis waited a little longer. Dad still had not returned. Growing anxious, he ran out to the road and looked into the distance. The darkness blurred everything. The longer Cutis looked, the more worried he became. Then, as if suddenly remembering that BUEM was alone in the room, Cutis quickly ran back into the house. He could not stay outside too long. BUEM needed him. Cutis returned to the bed and held BUEM in his arms again. BUEM weakly leaned into Cutis, as if that embrace made him less afraid. In that moment, BUEM seemed deeply touched. Because even though Cutis was small, even though Cutis was scared too, he did not leave. He still chose to stay beside him. Finally, hurried footsteps sounded outside the door. Cutis immediately lifted his head. Dad was back. In Dad's hand were the medicine and the bottle of oil he had just bought. He quickly entered the room, his eyes still full of concern, but his voice remained calm so Cutis and BUEM would not become more frightened. Cutis moved aside so Dad could come closer to BUEM. Dad carefully gave BUEM the medicine. Every movement was slow and gentle. Then he opened the bottle of oil, poured a little into his hand, and rubbed it gently over BUEM's stomach. Cutis sat nearby, watching every movement closely. This time, he was no longer as panicked as before. With Dad there, the room seemed to have a stronger place to lean on. But Cutis' eyes still could not hide his worry. He only hoped BUEM would feel better. Dad gently rubbed BUEM's stomach while comforting him. After a while, BUEM's breathing slowly became calmer. The painful expression on his face softened. His hands, which had been holding his stomach, gradually relaxed. Then BUEM drifted into sleep. Cutis watched him sleep, and still did not dare to breathe too loudly. He was afraid that if he made any noise, BUEM would wake up and hurt again. Dad looked at Cutis and gently said that BUEM had probably only had indigestion, and that medicine and rest would help him feel better. Only then did Cutis truly breathe with relief. He looked at BUEM for a long time. From the moment he found BUEM in pain, searched for the oil, almost went out to buy medicine, came back to call Dad, then stayed beside BUEM, and waited, all of Cutis' emotions seemed to gather into a quiet exhaustion. Dad understood that. He carried Cutis outside and gently closed the bedroom door so BUEM could sleep peacefully. Then he placed Cutis on a chair. Dad looked at Cutis' kept warm eyes. And then Dad thanked him. Not because Cutis had done everything perfectly, but because Cutis had cared, because he had known to ask for help, because he had stayed beside his little brother when he was needed. That thank you made Cutis' heart feel warm. After BUEM had fallen asleep, the house slowly became peaceful again. Dad told Cutis to sit on the chair and rest for a while. All evening, Cutis had been running up and down, worrying, fearing, and trying his very best for BUEM. Dad wanted Cutis to rest. Then Dad began cleaning the floor. Perhaps while everyone had been rushing to care for BUEM, the floor had become a little dirty. Dad quietly took a cloth and bent down to clean, helping the house become clean and warm again. Cutis sat on the chair and watched Dad. At first, he stayed silent. But seeing Dad working alone made Cutis feel unsettled. He had just been thanked by Dad. He had just been trusted by Dad, and now he wanted to help Dad again. Cutis climbed down from the chair and walked closer. He gently showed that he wanted to help Dad clean the floor. Dad looked at Cutis. Perhaps he wanted to tell him to rest. But seeing the determined look in Cutis' eyes, Dad understood that helping was also how Cutis felt useful. So Dad let Cutis join him. Father and son cleaned together. Cutis clumsily held the cloth and copied Dad's movements. Sometimes he did not clean well enough. Sometimes he did not know where to start. But Dad did not blame him. Dad simply smiled and guided him gently. Little by little, the tension from the evening faded away. In its place came Cutis' small laughter, Dad's gentle eyes, and the feeling that everything had finally become okay. BUEM was sleeping peacefully in the room. Dad was there. Cutis had done his part too. That night, Cutis learned something very important. Love does not mean doing everything alone. Sometimes, love means worrying at the right moment. It means knowing when to ask for help